what will the most drastic effects of climate change be?
The most drastic effects, boy, I think the sky's the limit in a way. After the last ice age, which happened 20,000 years ago, sea levels around the world rose by over 100 metres. So New Zealand went from being one main island, that is the North Island, South Island, Rakiura, Stewart Island were all one landmass, and now we have the three main islands plus a whole lot of outer lying ones, and that's just because the sea level is higher now. If we let the warming go on much longer, and that's maybe we get to say 3 degrees of warming globally, we might see the melting of a lot of ice around the world on the big ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland, and that could raise sea levels eventually by up to another 70 or 80 metres or so. So that would drown a lot of places. We don't know exactly where the threshold is, but we do know that at least parts of Antarctica and Greenland have this threshold, this tipping point where you start to melt the water around the edge of the marine part that sits in the water. Once the warmer water gets underneath that and starts to flow downhill, because the ice pushes the land down, it's so heavy, the water flows downhill and starts to lubricate the ice sheet, and it starts to melt, and you can't stop it. It would take a lot to melt all of the East Antarctic ice sheet, but there are parts of it that could start melting irreversibly within the next 30 or 40 years if we're not careful. So sea levels could rise by a couple of metres at worst this century, and could rise 10, 20, 30, 40, up to 70 or 80 metres ultimately. It would take a very long time for that to happen. So, there are billions of people who live within a few metres of present day sea level, so that could be catastrophic in itself. It would be a slow catastrophe because it does take a long time to melt ice. Something that's a bit more immediate, I think, is big changes in extreme events. So if we're seeing hurricanes and typhoons, tropical cyclones forming faster sometimes than they used to, and becoming very intense. There's the scale for tropical cyclones that goes from 1 to 5. 5's the most extreme. Scientists are now talking about needing 6, that we might have category 6 tropical cyclones or hurricanes appearing in the not too distant future. So that means even stronger winds, even more rain, bigger floods, more damage to infrastructure, more loss of life. The sorts of things we've seen in the last few months in the Northern Hemisphere, Hurricane Florence and Mangkhut that affected the Philippines and southern China and so on. Those events might become more routine, and we might see even stronger hurricanes. So the potential for damage to properties and human habitation infrastructure is very present, and of course the dangers for loss of life and loss of food production, all sorts of things that support human communities. The risks there are increasing, and we could see really catastrophic typhoons, hurricanes, tropical cyclones occurring over the next few decades, this century basically. There's a few novels out there you can read that talk about the sort of mega storms in the future, and maybe they're a bit far-fetched in some ways, but that is the trend, that we're seeing more energy in the climate system, so the possibility of getting extreme events increases. For New Zealand, we're not so affected by tropical storms, but we do see the remnants of those storms drift south and affect us sometimes. And last summer in 2017-18 we saw 3 come within striking distance of New Zealand, and you can have really violent storms, winds, lots of rain, and because the amount of moisture in the air is related to temperature, when it rains you get more rain, so the chances of getting really off the charts flooding is going up all the time, as well as the chances of getting off the charts high temperatures. Colleagues of mine here at Victoria published a paper, I think about a year ago, looking at the risks of these unprecedented extreme temperature events. And with the sort of future where we don't take any action on reducing emissions, then by the 2040s, only 20 or 25 years away, there are parts of the tropical Pacific just to the north of us that might be seeing unprecedented extreme high temperatures. And it would take a bit longer over New Zealand because there's so much more variability and it's just a more temperate climate anyway. But by the end of the century, we would be seeing unusually high temperatures, and that would naturally damage our ability to grow food and feed ourselves, because all the crops that we rely on have been adapted to the climate we used to have, and the climate has already changed. We've had a degree of warming in the last century. How much more we get this century and beyond really comes down to what we do globally with emissions, but at best we might get another degree. That's the best case scenario. Even that is a huge change. It will be a warmer climate than the Earth has known for probably over 100,000 years. And we've got all of our agricultural systems set up to make best use of the present climate, or actually the past climate, the climate we had 50 years ago. So there's going to have to be a lot of adaptation there. There was a really interesting article published in the New York magazine in July of 2017 called "The Uninhabitable Earth." A journalist by the name of David Wallace Wells took basically the upper end of all the scenarios published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, talked to a bunch of scientists about this, and he wrote about the worst case scenario, you might say. What if it warmed up as much as the upper end of the range, if we don't rein in the greenhouse gas emissions and so on, and rainfall changes and so on and so on. And he was saying that parts of the world would literally be uninhabitable because they'd be so hot that you just couldn't really survive outside, and the rainfall would change. Either it would get so dry in the desert areas that you just couldn't live, or it would get so wet that there'd be catastrophic flooding pretty often, and really strong winds and all the rest of it. So it would make some parts of the world literally uninhabitable, or you'd have to be really, really keen and resilient to live in some places. And he talked about the kind of effects on agriculture generally, food production, migration, sea level rise is already affecting some parts of the world to the extent that people are thinking about having to leave. And some of the Pacific Islands are in that category. Also, a country like Bangladesh, which has a big population, a good fraction of that population live within a metre of sea level, current sea level. So a metre of sea level rise, which is quite on the cards for the next 100 years, would mean a large number of people would have to move. So there's a lot of thought going into this idea of climate change, refugees, climate change, migration, and how we deal with that. And it's not a situation that's really been tackled by the global community before. Whole countries, perhaps, certainly in the Pacific and some of the smaller island states elsewhere, having to move, and this idea of portable sovereignty comes up. Can you kind of take your country with you and then put a flag in the ground in New Zealand or Australia or whatever and say, okay, this is now Vanuatu or whatever place it might be. Can you relocate a whole culture to a different country? It's a pretty hard question. I mean, it can be done physically, I suppose, but what it means emotionally and culturally to people is, yet to be seen, I think. We'll probably find out.